everybody, and welcome back. I am joined today by Jill, who is, as far as I know, not a super horsey person, but is incredibly knowledgeable about immigration, which is what we're going to talk about today. So, Jill, do you want to introduce yourself and just chat a little bit about? I mean, normally I ask people what got them into horses, but I guess that's not really applicable. So, just whatever introduction feels right.
Well, Georgia, thank you for having me here. I actually was a horsey person as a young person, and I was riding at summer camp over many years when suddenly one day I had a bout of anaphylaxis and needed to be taken away from the summer camp in an ambulance because I am allergic to all beautiful animals, it turns out, including horses. And that was it for me and horses. But I have mad respect. I am a neurodivergent homosexual, so I do have a lot of horse friends, horse girl friends. Yeah, and I was excited to meet you at a conference recently, and I'm excited to be here and talk immigration, my one true love.
That's so upsetting. I cannot imagine finding out that you're just like anaphylactically allergic to all critters. That's oh my god.
Well, now humans have figured out how to make, hypoallergenic dogs. So I do have a little pup who is a poodle Bichon mix named Penny. So I do have one little critter in my life, and it's pretty good.
Okay, good. Well, awesome. As far as immigration goes, I was really excited and really wanted to talk to you because I am not as knowledgeable about immigration law as frankly I would like to be. And I think that I have largely grown up in a little bit of a bubble up here in New England. But one of the common factors across a lot of the larger barns, at least in like hunter jumper and eventing fields, is that a lot of the working population tends to be Hispanic, and a lot of those folks are immigrants, both documented and undocumented. And as we know, farm workers as a whole are a largely immigrant population. So I'm just hoping to explore kind of what impact they're seeing right now and what is happening.
Yeah, thank you so much for using your platform to bring some of these intersections to light. Yeah, I'm an immigration lawyer. For your listeners, I'm Jill Martin Diaz. I run a program in Vermont, the Vermont Asylum Assistance Project, and I previously taught immigration law at the law school level, and now I teach practice at the undergraduate level. And I'm finding that this year, the kind of great awakening happening with unsuspecting allies and intersectors, it's remarkable to me just how clearly immigration policy and practice directly impacts the very fabric of our society. When I told some of my friends and colleagues that I was going to come chat with you today on your show, they were like, what's the connection there? And as you just pointed out, well, it turns out that the US built our economic system on the backs of underdocumented laborers who US immigration law has deliberately kept underdocumented for the purposes of maximizing profiting at their expense. And so we find ourselves now in this moment where there is an administration in power of implementing immigration policy that is focused exclusively on removing people's rights to have rights, removing people's immigration status, and then removing them physically from the US. Whereas to date, we've typically had administrations whose policy agendas strike a balance between accessing immigration status, accessing the right to have rights for some, and maybe while also excluding others. This administration, the Trump administration, is focused explicitly on exclusion. And so we're seeing these ripple effects in every area of our economy, not just in our agricultural or rural workforce, but in our schools and our healthcare system and our tax base, our business ownership. It's hugely impactful for everyone.
It's really interesting because, like I said, I think that in New England it's less common in horse circles. But I think one of the things that I was thinking about, because the last barn I was at actually did have a couple of folks. I have no idea what their documentation status was at all. Um, but it was the first time I'd ever come face to face with that sort of dynamic. And one of the things that I thought about was like, what what do you do if ICE shows up at your barn? Like that, I wouldn't even know where to begin.
That is the question this year, isn't it? As soon as the new administration began to implement its policy agenda of mass arrests, mass detentions, mass deportations, and not for any rhyme or reason, but simply with a goal of hitting numbers, hitting milestones, right? Suddenly, no one was safe, and everyone needed to learn in every setting what to do if ICE shows up at blank. That is probably the most asked question of 2025, and previous administrations would use policy statements to kind of give the community notice of how they intended to marshal their resources, of who they intended to prioritize for accessing status or for losing status. But this administration has very effectively flooded the field with fear, right? Fear is the strategy. And if every single stakeholder in every type of quasi-public place, a barn, a school, a storage facility, a healthcare clinic, the post office, whatever it is, if every single one of those stakeholders, every person now in the country is saying, what do I do if I shows up at blank? And the answer for most attorneys who aren't giving these kinds of know your rights presentations frequently, lawyers, our standard answer is it depends. Right? It's case by case. It depends. And then what you've done, the tactic has worked very well. I think that people are really feeling chilled by the fear of what to do if ICE shows up at the barn. And then there's this second piece where even when advocates tried in good faith to go out and do as much know your rights education as possible to different sectors, what to do if ICE shows up at blank. Now there's this second issue where ICE is not following its own rules. So when we give know your rights, we have to now separate our presentations into two parts. What to do if ICE shows up. And the second part of my presentation has now standardized as, and what to do when ICE does the wrong thing. What to do when ICE breaks the rules, violates your rights. It's like, you need to know your rights, but you also need to expect that your rights will be violated and know what to do when your rights will be violated. And that is the complexity that is impacting the folks that you mentioned who you've met in the bars you've worked at.
What an interesting time to be alive where we are talking about what to do when your rights are violated.
Right, by the government, right? The government that's supposed to be the custodian of implementing Congress's will. Like Congress and the courts have made law for all of us. And then the executive branch that reports to the president are supposed to carry out the law. But now, what if they're the ones breaking the law? And who do you go to for recourse? Because there are no rights without remedies, right? So we need to be able to access the courts or other avenues for review to say, hey, my rights were violated. And unfortunately, immigration status and the many other factors that often correlate with being an immigrant laborer in the US, limited, being English learning, being a person of color who's subject to disproportionate policing at the local level. A lot of these different factors will make you like especially vulnerable to having your rights violated and not having access to recourse. So it's a special problem that we have in front of us today. It certainly wasn't invented today, right? Immigration laws have been this draconian forever. They have been recently in the custody of executive administrations that are balancing that mix of accessing status for some and losing status for others. And we could talk a little bit about the false binary of that zero sum game. But yeah, this environment is definitely an overwhelming one to practice in. And my heart really goes out to the folks who are listening, who are personally impacted by these issues, and the folks who are working in these industries. We see you and we're here for you.
You touched on so many interesting things, and I have like a bazillion questions I want to ask you about all of them. But the first one is, what are a couple of things, or like what are some of the themes in how the law has actually changed this year? Like, what has actually changed about the law itself? Not the way that it's being implemented or enforced, but like the actual law itself.
Very little has changed about the actual law. Very little. The law is supposed to be a slow moving beast, right? Incremental change so that we're not rushing into any change and causing irreparable harms in a way that we can't course correct from, right? Law advances, the courts consider the nuances. They might tell the lawmakers to fix this or fix that, decide parts of the law that can't be implemented. It is slow changing by design. And that's true of the Immigration Nationality Act, which makes up the immigration statutes at Title 8 of the US Code. It's a federal system of law. And it's had a few additions over the decades, a few changes, but really hasn't had a dramatic change for 50 years. And certainly not the part of the statute that I spend most of my time in, the asylum and refugee statute. That hasn't been changed since the Refugee Act of 1980. The US has long held, since we signed international law following World War II, that every person on earth deserves to have a safe place to go and be and exist. And when a person finds themselves here in the US, we've agreed not only to not return them to persecution or torture as defined by the law, but we've given an option, a pathway to permanency if the fact finder decides that the person is deserving. So not only do you have a right to not be returned to your persecution, you may be given the discretionary option to pursue permanent residence and ultimately citizenship. And none of that has changed at all in decades. Fast forward to 2025, there was one little amendment made to the Immigration Nationality Act in the first weeks of the Trump administration. The Laken-Riley Act passed by Congress, and that was an act to grow the list of mandatorily detainable people who are being charged with removability in the immigration legal system, which is a civil system of law. So basically, ICE already had this huge swath of discretion to detain people facing removability, really to quote unquote keep the community safe pending the removal proceedings, to make sure that the respondents in removal proceedings would continue to present and participate and not abscond. And in the first weeks of the Trump administration, Congress passed the Laken-Riley Act, made that list of mandatory detention factors longer, but it's a pretty niche area of the statute compared to the birth of immigration law that we have, and none of it has changed. What's changed is the ways in which the Trump administration has interpreted their discretion that they've been delegated by Congress in some ways that seem maybe permitted under the law, and in other ways that seem explicitly forbidden under the law. And so it's kind of an emerging field of policy and practice, but no, the law hasn't changed.
That is like reassuring and frustrating to hear. You know what I mean? Like, that's like, oh well, we could still course correct from this. We haven't made the permanency of it all. And at the same time, it's like, all right, okay, so we're just continuing to flagrantly disobey our constitution and the things that we hold to be true. Got it.
Right. I mean, that's the thing. Just as well, the humanitarian protections that our immigration law makes available for people who need protection. Similarly, it's been decades that our immigration laws have allowed for this seemingly like unconstitutional, fundamentally unfair, no process afforded, like terrible civil immigration system that is not really civil and it's not really criminal and it's really insulated from external review or accountability. It's wildly insulated from checks and balances. And now we're seeing all of the dangerous corners of the statute that we're just waiting to fall into the wrong hands are all being activated. Some questionably legally, some like flagrantly illegally. And we're like, oh, these are the laws that have always been on the books. We've always allowed ICE to just do whatever. And now what, right? So my hope is not only are we seizing this moment of awakening around our immigration system and how fundamentally broken and unfair and unjust it was designed to be. It was founded on explicitly racist terms, racism that wasn't outright banned from the statute until the last century, like recently. And I'm hopeful that we'll all want to change the law now. I'm hoping that will not only galvanize coordination and service and solidarity that our community members need, and then moving ahead, we'll elect a Congress that's going to pass immigration reform. Long overdue.
That would be ideal. And one thing you've touched on a couple of times that I just want to clarify is that you've said that the immigration system is considered a civil section of the law, which my understanding is that means that that means that the courts are not required to appoint you a lawyer. Is that
Correct.
true?
That's correct.
So we have folks who are non-English speakers trying to navigate the system with no help.
Correct. And what's more, Supreme Court jurisprudence has found that the executive interest of protecting national security is so much more important than anyone's individual rights or freedoms that ICE can lie. So what we have seen in our detention defense practice here in Vermont and our know your rights, like corrective know your rights work with agricultural workers and others at risk of enforcement here in Vermont, is that folks who have interacted with the government have been affirmatively misinformed about what their options are. Like bold-faced lies. And what the Supreme Court has held over the years is that, well, the president is keeping the homeland safe. The national security interest is just so acute, particularly in border zones like Vermont, particularly for people who are recently arriving or can't prove otherwise, because maybe they're unbanked and don't have leases and whatever. And so that kind of the government's national security interest is going to come before your individual rights and civil rights interests, which is just truly, it's wild to watch it unfold in practice. But I say civil, not criminal. I mean, it signifies a few things, right? Because when you look at imagery of ICE enforcement in 2025, and you're learning about the plight of individuals who were held in ICE custody in either ICE facilities or in subcontracted state facilities, which is the system that we use for detention here in Vermont. It's you're in prison, right? You are completely deprived of your liberty. You are in prison. You are isolated and alone. You don't have a right to counsel. They are not supposed to obstruct your access to your counsel, but the system doesn't provide one for you. They're supposed to provide for language access, but good luck finding out that you have language access rights and figuring out who to complain to when they're violated when you are English learning. It's like it's a civil system so that it's insulated from accountability and review. But it's very criminal in nature in terms of the experience of being detained is akin to the deprivation of liberty that people face when they have criminal charges. And the ultimate penalty of banishment, permanent separation from your family and home, is as severe as a life without parole sentence in the criminal system. So it's this really strange hybrid system that the government has successfully convinced the Supreme Court to treat very specially and differently because of the national security interests. And people like me, advocates, are concerned now watching that the authoritarianism normalize in immigration practice nowadays. I'm worried that it's not just the fundamental fairness and freedoms of immigrants that's at stake. It's fundamental fairness and freedom for everyone.
So thinking about like national security and the tales that we are told about immigrants, like the stories that are weaved, I want to go back to something that you said earlier that had a little bit of a visual component that I would just want to note, is that you said if you're found deserving, and you used finger quotes around that, which I loved, because what do you mean deserve? Who gets to decide? Like, that's so messed up that we have decided that you can be found not deserving of a home. Like,
humanity,
that's what it comes down to.
Totally.
So it's just interesting to think about the way that we have all been fed propaganda our entire lives about it. And I think that, like you've said, other administrations have been using the same laws and doing the same terrible things, just under a level that the propaganda could convince us was okay and acceptable.
Totally. And it what I don't think I've really came to appreciate the depth of the conspiracy, right? Of this, like the myth, the way that the myth is reincarnated and fed to us and reinforced. And until I started teaching immigration law doctrinally at the law school level, because there's a section, the first section of the course, and using the textbook that I use, my old professor, Mary Ellen Fullerton, shout out, is the history of the US immigration law. Because the number one question I get from people who are newer to the topic this year is, how is that legal? That's the question. Right. If question number one of 2025 is what to do if ICE shows up at blank, then the second question is, but how is that legal? How is that allowed? How is that legal? And when you study the history of US immigration law, it makes so much sense how it's legal. The system was designed during a migrant workforce boom, and there were an influx of Chinese laborers who were in the American West during the Western colonization. There was an expansion into the West, an economic boom. There were migrant laborers coming to the US because extractive capitalism in the US has always relied on migrant workers to work, to run. And as migrant laborers were settling down and having babies and having kids and maybe wanting to go visit family back in China and return, like exit and re-enter, we start to have these questions about, well, how many, like, we don't want you to have it too good because you're here to make us money. You're not here, like, this isn't about you. So, like, what do we need to do to kind of keep you working? And that's how the first immigration laws got passed, the Chinese Exclusion Acts, as they're now called, a series of statutes passed by Congress to address concerns among white Americans that Chinese laborers, like Native American people, were going to get too many rights and they would have access to too many resources. The number one myth that we've all been sold by the American dream is the scarcity myth, that there are not enough resources or rights to go around. There's just a finite number of rights, and we want to make sure we give rights to the right people. Naturally, everyone can't have the rights, so we need to marshal them very carefully. And that is how we started having questions of, well, who's a citizen and who gets to participate in the polity, who gets access to economic upward mobility, to owning land and to voting and making decisions and being autonomous. And it was really clear all the way through the 1920s that whiteness was the number one threshold factor for eligibility for citizenship in the United States. Everyone who is not a citizen lacks the access to some rights, right? If citizenship is the access, the right to have rights, anything short of citizenship, whether it's some kind of temporary worker status or student status, tourist status, or maybe even permanent residence, which is a misnomer because it could be taken away, it's having less than the full right to have rights. And that is so that you can be contained and your prosperity can be contained and your ability to access resources and rights can be contained. It wasn't until the mid-century that the US Congress banned race-based discrimination in the immigration system outright. So we have this legacy of creating an underdocumented working class from whom land owning citizens who were previously slave owners, from whom they could extract inputs into their business ventures and maximize profits for the benefits of the citizenry. And so just learning all of that history and really and looking at it semester after semester with students really helped me understand pretty early into 2024 that I kind of knew what was coming this year. I mean, I thought I did. And I felt like my role in my sector, in my state, was to just help help our community partners start to face this truth about what this new enforcement climate was going to look like for our communities, and figure out how we're going to reduce harm. And in rural communities like Vermont, agricultural places in New England that have aging populations, that have demographic cliffs, the economists say, the risk to our future is particularly acute of a mass enforcement environment. There's a lot of different stakeholders who are coming to the table to work together to try and mitigate the harm for our impacted community members.
Oh, it's really interesting to hear you talk about the way that we are told these stories and like how they were put together and all that stuff. Because I mean, one of my soapboxes is that America's really good at selling us the myth of individualism and convincing us that you really do have to look out for yourself, otherwise you'll fall apart, which is false. We are nothing without community. So, but like in those stories, I'm hearing these like threads of like collectivism where it's like, oh, well, we got to look out for the people who are here. But the way that that's sold is still because you don't want your rights taken away. You don't want to have less. It's not actually a collectivist mindset. It's still the individualism. It's just being sold as we're really looking out for you.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm an advocate, right? And so in this podcast, I have already tapped into that because that strategy has been serving me well this year in bringing on board people who previously voted for Trump, people who are centrist Republicans, people who believe in like a libertarian small government. There's a lot of folks here in New England that are feeling awakened and motivated by the immigration enforcement climate of this year to try and revisit what some of their early positions were on immigration. But you're absolutely right. The general, like the three kind of narratives that advocates are tapping into to help bring people along for this journey is one, I mean, there's the humanitarian one, which is just like humans are humans and humans deserve humanity, and no legal fiction is going to overcome someone's humanity, and there actually isn't a scarcity of rights, and there actually isn't a scarcity of resources. It's just inequitably distributed by opportunistic oligarchs. I mean, the humanitarian piece is the one that called a lot of us advocates to the work. And it is the one that I think I'm noticing in the community people are most tired by, because there's so many competing humanitarian disasters right now in our healthcare system and our education system. I'm also a non-binary trans person for queer people, and everyone, we've like, again, the scarcity myth, we think there's this zero-sum game of like, if we're taking care of these people's rights, we're not, like, we have to prioritize who's more deserving. So the humanitarian perspective is one. The other is this idea of like the economic and social advancement that we will all individually benefit, and we will benefit collectively if we can maintain our young, working age, business owning, reproducing migrant community, right, for the benefit of the machine. And then this third piece that has also been, to your point, like very much individualized. Like, if you think that this thing that is happening to non-citizens could never happen to you, think again. When non-citizens lose their right to speech, you lose your right to speech. When non-citizens lose access to due process, you lose access to due process. We are setting a precedent for everyone. But I know it's funny because it's so effective, these narratives, and I totally, as a public advocate, like totally tap into them. And it's wild because when you're with your community member, your family member, your partner, you're looking yourself in the mirror, whatever the situation is, and you're like, I'm just a human. And that's that. But the scarcity myth has given rise to, a lot of really abhorrent policy and practices for the last many years. So like, to go back in the other direction, your earlier question was like, what's new in the law? Well, the answer is nothing. And then the question is, okay, what's new in the practice? I don't want to say that there aren't new dynamics to the practice this year. I have not previously encountered in my study and work experience officers of the court, attorneys, like bold-faced lying about facts and law to the judges' faces. Like there is bad faith, bad action happening now in the rules of play that like make me really worried about the health of the system. But otherwise, draconian immigration enforcement practices have been a part of our practices for the last many years. And in fact, the Democratic administrations have been some of the worst offenders. The Clinton administration oversaw the increased criminalization of immigrants. The Biden administration set a record for deporting the most non-citizens ever in the history of our country. And then the Biden administration continued that with the COVID era summary expulsions under the health code at Title 42, which also saw the largest number of summary expulsions in the country's history. So, I don't want to make it sound either like draconian immigration policy and practice is new. And in the Biden administration, we had a lot of new arrivals, people who were being granted access to temporary protections, like Afghan nationals, like Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, and Venezuelan parolees, people for whom there was no sustainability planning done in service delivery. There were a lot of new people invited into our country who set up their lives and live their lives. And then suddenly the Trump administration comes and with the flip of a switch says all of these discretionary protections are over and all these people are now up for removal if we find them. This was a system that was created by the previous Democratic administration. So it's not about partisanship from my perspective. It's really about, we all, I think, have a duty to like think about what is the lesson that we're learning about how we treat human beings and laborers, and how we pit immigrant subpopulations against each other as more or less deserving of their basic humanity.
Well, and to spin it, not that it needs to be spun positively, but to spin more towards a positive light. I've heard you say a couple of times that you've been having good conversations. People are like seeing people come out of the woodworks who maybe were not wanting to be involved before. And one of the biggest things that I've been thinking about, that has always been a question of mine, but I've really been thinking about this year, is just like, how do I use my privilege as a white girl from New England, from an upper middle class family? Like, how do I use my privilege to positively impact the world? And I'm seeing a lot of people in my circles, like my horse circles too, asking these questions, which I've been really impressed by, because a lot of times equestrian communities, at least the ones who are paying for boarding at facilities, I want to clarify that a lot of the people who have the horses in their backyards are fairly liberal, but the people who have the money to pay to be at facilities tend to be wealthy conservatives. And I am seeing some of them take a turn and be like, wait, I'm not okay with this. I've gotten messages from people who I know about this podcast who responded to it in a positive light that I never would have expected from them, because of this like turn of, oh my gosh, this is terrible, we do need to do something. So I'd love to hear from your perspective, what can people do to utilize their privilege or to get involved in their communities or whatever that might be? If somebody's just like, I need to do something, what do I do?
Oh, I love this question. There is so much we can do. Because remember, fear is the strategy, right? They're flooding the field with scary things because what to do when ice shows up blank is an infinity question, right? You could just like fill in the blank infinity. And that can be really paralyzing and overwhelming. And I think that's by design, right? Because if that's where we're focusing our energy and attention, then we're not carrying on with community. And actually there's a lot we can do for for ourselves and for each other. So one thing I think about, especially when we're bringing in the dynamic of people with relational privilege on this issue, yes, there is unprecedented misinformation being weaponized by algorithms worldwide like never before. It is a really scary time, right, to be on the internet. And at the same time, we have democratic access to quality, peer-reviewed, vetted information like never before. And that's also an amazing strength that we all have as community who wants to support each other. There are a lot of great self-education websites that are out there, and lots of organizations like mine are cross-referencing each other and trying to really build up the network of this is what the peer-reviewed quality information is about what the law says and what is actually happening with implementation and how to keep yourself safe. I urge people with relational privilege to please take the time to use all of those skills that you developed in your educational experiences and professional experiences to educate yourselves, think critically, and then think about how you can be a source of quality information for the people around you who have barriers to accessing that info, right? Like, to go back to your colleagues at the barn that you referenced, like, it's good to be curious and ask the question, like, have you had the chance to participate in any know your rights activities in your community about this issue? Is this a question you have? Or even to the owner of the business or place of work, like, do you have a policy in place? Have you learned what to do if ICE shows up here in the barn? And do you have a policy and practice in place? And as regular citizens, you can go and educate yourself on what some of the best practices are, and then you can look around in your immediate vicinity and see if there's a way you can make that information available. Because the one thing that we don't have right now is enough lawyers to go around. And my experience as a lawyer, even though being a lawyer doesn't mean you know everything, you just know how to look up most things. I don't know most things, but I know how to look them up. And people, especially with something like this that's very high stakes and personal and physically threatening, people really want to hear it from the lawyer's mouth. And there's just not enough lawyers to go around. And actually, one way that you can help keep lawyers like me focused on my caseload so that I can be working through my cases diligently and accepting the next case as I get the request is to help absorb some of the community legal education, know your rights work that we were helping to set up earlier this year and are now largely handing over to community groups and like loose community organizers and mutual aid groups. So that's a really big piece. I think another big piece is honestly, like, there's just some tricks that we use in our know your rights education of like, if you know that fear is the strategy, what are some affirmative tools that you can use to combat the strategy? Like, truly, how can you, it's not just about like, oh, I need to yoga my way out of burnout and I need to not scroll because my eyeballs want to rest. But think about it as a form of activism to really be fastidious about a self-care practice, like self-soothing and self-care, and protect your peace, protect the resources of yours that are finite, your time and your energy, so that you can identify a specific constructive action, solidarity action to take and feel like you have the bandwidth to take it. I know when we're all feeling burned out and feeling pulled in a million directions, showing up to phone bank for a campaign or showing up in solidarity at a state house for an immigrant friendly bill that's being passed, like, that might just feel like too much. And so protect your peace so that you can so that you can commit to taking a specific action at the recommendation of your local leadership, and do so in a way that feels good. You give what you can, but take what you need. I think there's enough rights, there's enough resources, and there's enough of us going around to take care of each other. If we all take on a little bit of the work, I really do think that we could exit this moment not only more aware of how we can stand in solidarity with our immigrant community members who have always been at risk of violent enforcement. But, we can also think about, well, how much at a state level do we want immigration status or lack thereof to impact someone's daily life? Like, we get to decide, because the feds might say, well, at the federal level, that means you don't have health insurance and you can't have a bank account and you can't get a license and you can't leave, you can't do anything, you can't get a professional license. But at the state level, we could say, well, you can get a driver's license here and you can get health insurance here and you can access financial aid for education here. And that kind of like forward looking work, leveraging the energy around the immigration awakening this year toward those kinds of forward looking solutions, I think is the best thing we can do besides witnessing and accompanying work, right? There's a lot of call for just being a witness to people who are interacting with the immigration system in different government offices, so that there's more eyes, more accountability, more recourse for violations.
Yeah, that's an awesome answer. And like, to anybody listening, if you are a horse girl, I know that you are a brave individual because you choose to engage in a hobby that punishes mistakes with death. So congratulations, you have the spine to do it. And also, I would hope, if you are a horse person, you know how to prioritize your energy and take care of yourself, because we all know it's easy to burn out if you are just doing things over and over again. So like, look, you already have the skills. Now you can get engaged in the work and use those skills to help your neighbors and your friends and the people around you and the people who literally take care of your horse for you day in and day out.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, right, when you put it that way, I'm like, oh my gosh, we do like mobilize the horse girls. We need you. That's yes.
I I feel like white women at protests have an energy that is just unmatched. Like, just absolutely go for it, girlie. Like, pop off, yell in that police officer's face. Do it. I love that for you. It's really impressive. I'm impressed every time I see an angry white woman who has decided that she cares about somebody else is something to be reckoned with.
Truly. And to your earlier point about how widely impacting an enforcement immigration agenda is, like how harmful it is to so much of society. What I'm seeing in my work is like angry white Republican women, like people who have served in the state house as Republican representatives of state government, like people who are senior in the party, who are standing up and saying no and being very courageous and bold champions of defense work that we're doing at my organization, and that community orgs are driving. And it's so cool because there's this, I think people, I don't know, I'll speak for myself. I was feeling a little deflated by this whole narrative of like the left is eating itself, and this is why we're getting what we deserve. Now we can all sit and suffer because we can't work together. And I just don't, that's not my experience in the immigration justice space. I see a lot of people coming together and showing each other grace, coming as you are, offering what you can, and just trying to show care for each other in a hard time. I think it's great.
Well, thank you so much, Jill. This was such a wonderful conversation. Do you have a website or something that people can go to if they want more information or they want to get involved or make a donation or whatever it might be?
We certainly do. Thank you. So again, we're the Vermont Asylum Assistance Project, or VAP. People joke with me, oh, is it vape? I'm like, sure, whatever you want. Choose your own adventure. Our URL is vaapvt.org. Yes, vap.org was taken. So again, it's vaapvt.org, or we're at VT Asylum on socials. And we curate a newsletter with substantive updates on policy and practice. We do a lot of local advocacy work in solidarity with community orgs. We also curate a self-help library that cross-references those national partners I spoke about earlier. And we make our website available in a multitude of languages. So please see it as a resource, see us as a resource. And if you're doing similar work in other areas and want to connect, we'd love to hear from you.
And I will put those links in the description of this episode as well, so that way it's nice and easy to find. So thank you again, Jill. It was so great talking to you, and we will talk to you later.
Likewise. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us this week at the Horse Girl Gazetteer. You can find us online at Horse Girl Gazetteer on Facebook or Instagram, and Horse Girl Gazette on TikTok and Patreon. You can email us questions or comments at hello@horsegirlgazetteer.com. If you find yourself enjoying our content, please leave us a review to help others find their way here. Any and all support is greatly appreciated. Talk to you later.